For the last 3 years, Microsoft has been treated as the company that got artificial intelligence right before anyone else. Its early multi-billion-dollar bet on OpenAI back in 2023 was widely described as one of the smartest corporate moves in modern technology history, and for a while, that narrative held up perfectly. But if you have been paying close attention to what has actually been happening inside Microsoft over the past several months, a very different picture has started to emerge. The stock has taken a serious hit. The company's own AI leadership has publicly admitted to falling behind. The once rock-solid partnership with OpenAI has quietly transformed into something closer to a rivalry, and the massive spending required to keep the whole operation running is starting to raise serious questions on Wall Street. In this video, we are going to walk through exactly what is happening, using real, verifiable, documented events, not speculation or exaggeration, so you can understand precisely where Microsoft's AI strategy actually stands right now. Let's start with the stock price, because numbers tend to cut through a lot of corporate messaging. Microsoft shares have fallen sharply from their all-time high reached back in October of 2025, with reports pointing to a decline of roughly 36% from that peak. Some analysts have described the opening quarter of 2026 as one of the worst stretches for Microsoft stock since the depths of the 2008 financial crisis. That is a striking comparison for a company that has spent the better part of 2 decades being treated as one of the safest, most stable names in the entire technology sector. The reasons behind this decline are not mysterious or hidden. Investors have grown increasingly uneasy about 2 overlapping concerns. The first is that Microsoft and its fellow cloud computing giants are pouring unprecedented amounts of money into data centers and computing infrastructure without a clear, immediate path to matching revenue growth. The second is that AI-powered tools built by competitors, including OpenAI itself, along with companies like Anthropic, could end up squeezing the pricing and profit margins on Microsoft's own core software products over time. The capital spending numbers alone are enormous enough to explain a lot of the market's nervousness. According to reporting based on Microsoft's own financial disclosures, the company's capital expenditures are projected to climb from around $88 billion in fiscal year 2025 to somewhere near $191 billion by fiscal year 2028. That represents an average annual growth rate approaching 30% for multiple years in a row, almost entirely driven by the need to build and expand data centers capable of running increasingly demanding AI models. To put that in perspective, this is a company essentially betting that if it builds enough computing capacity today, it will be positioned to dominate an AI-driven future tomorrow. Microsoft's own leadership, including Chief Executive Satya Nadella, has defended this approach by pointing to the company's long history of playing a similar long game with products like Windows, Office, and Azure, where heavy upfront investment eventually gave way to dominant market position and strong margins once adoption reached sufficient scale. Whether that same playbook works identically for AI remains an open and genuinely contested question among analysts, some of whom remain confident the strategy will eventually pay off, and others who worry that the AI infrastructure race has become a spending war with no clear finish line in sight. Now let's talk about Copilot, because this is where some of the most concrete disappointment has shown up. Copilot is Microsoft's flagship AI assistant, woven throughout its entire product lineup, including Microsoft 365, Windows, GitHub, and its various enterprise tools. It was positioned as the centerpiece of Microsoft's entire AI monetization strategy, the product that would justify all that infrastructure spending by getting millions of businesses to pay a premium for AI-powered productivity features. According to reporting that surfaced in mid-2026, Copilot's actual paid seat numbers have landed meaningfully below what Wall Street had been expecting, with figures cited around 20 million paid seats, a number that sounds significant on its own but falls well short of the scale many analysts had modeled given Microsoft's massive installed base of Office and Windows customers worldwide. When a company spends this much money building the infrastructure for an AI product, and that product's adoption numbers underwhelm relative to expectations, it naturally raises pointed questions about the return on that investment, which helps explain a meaningful chunk of the stock pressure Microsoft has been dealing with. Perhaps the most unusual and telling development in this entire story is what Microsoft's own AI leadership has said publicly about the company's position. Mustafa Suleyman, the executive who leads Microsoft's AI division, gave an interview in early June of 2026 in which he openly acknowledged that his team is playing catch-up against rivals, including OpenAI's own consumer products, Anthropic's Claude, and coding-focused tools like Cursor. This is a remarkably candid admission from a senior executive at one of the largest technology companies in the world, especially considering how aggressively Microsoft marketed its early AI leadership position just a couple of years earlier. Suleyman reportedly expressed confidence in Microsoft's longer-term plan, which involves building custom AI chips, deeper integration between models, and the tools people actually use, and heavier investment in reinforcement learning techniques designed to make Microsoft's own models more capable over time. But the underlying admission itself, that the company widely credited with making the boldest early AI bet in the industry now sees itself as chasing rather than leading, is a genuinely significant shift in the public narrative around Microsoft's AI ambitions. Adding another layer of complexity to the story is an incident involving Microsoft's internal policies around competing AI tools. Reports emerged indicating that Microsoft employees were quietly instructed to stop using Claude Code, the coding assistant built by Anthropic, inside the company. On the surface, this might look like a minor internal IT policy decision, but symbolically, it says a lot about the competitive anxiety running through the AI industry right now. A company that spent years building its identity around openness to outside AI tools and partnerships found itself restricting its own employees from using a competitor's product, which several industry observers interpreted as a sign of just how seriously Microsoft is taking the threat from rival AI labs, even inside its own walls. This brings us to arguably the biggest structural shift in this entire story, which is the changing nature of Microsoft's relationship with OpenAI itself. For years, this partnership was described almost as a single unified front, with Microsoft investing billions of dollars into OpenAI in exchange for exclusive rights to host OpenAI's models on Azure and integrate them deeply into Microsoft's own products. That arrangement fundamentally changed on April 27th of 2026, when Microsoft and OpenAI jointly announced a restructured agreement that ended years of exclusive cloud dependency between the two companies. Under the new terms, OpenAI is free to license its models and serve its products across other major cloud providers, including direct Microsoft competitors like Amazon and Google. In exchange, Microsoft no longer has to share a cut of certain AI-related revenue with OpenAI, and the payments OpenAI owes Microsoft are now capped at a fixed ceiling, rather than continuing indefinitely tied to OpenAI's performance. The backstory behind this restructuring reveals just how much strain had built up in the relationship. OpenAI's computing needs had grown so large that Microsoft's own infrastructure could no longer keep pace, pushing OpenAI to pursue major partnerships with Microsoft's own rivals, including a reported $500 billion data center initiative involving Oracle and SoftBank, along with a separate multi-billion-dollar cloud computing deal with Amazon that reportedly includes Amazon investing up to $50 billion directly into OpenAI. Microsoft had reportedly even considered legal action earlier in 2026 over concerns that some of these emerging OpenAI partnerships conflicted with the exclusivity terms of their original agreement before the two sides ultimately negotiated the restructured deal instead of heading toward a legal dispute. This is not a full breakup between the two companies. Microsoft remains OpenAI's primary cloud partner, retains licensing rights to OpenAI's technology through 2032, and OpenAI products are still expected to launch on Azure first whenever Microsoft is able to support them. But the exclusivity that once defined this relationship, or the arrangement that made Microsoft look like it had a permanent protected lock on the most advanced AI technology in the world, is now gone. And that shift alone has forced a serious reassessment of how durable Microsoft's AI advantage actually is. Making this situation even more complicated is the fact that Microsoft has been simultaneously building its own competing in-house AI models, a project generally referred to under its MAI branding. Reports indicate Microsoft has released models like MAI Image 2 for image generation and MAI Transcribe 1 for audio transcription, positioned to directly compete with OpenAI's own offerings in the same categories, such as OpenAI's DALL-E and Whisper products. Microsoft has also built out a platform called Foundry, which gives the company more direct control over its own AI model training, deployment, and monetization without needing to route everything through OpenAI's technology. From a pure business strategy standpoint, this makes a lot of sense, since no company wants to be permanently dependent on a single external partner for its most important product category. But it also means that OpenAI, which for years functioned essentially as Microsoft's core AI engine, is increasingly finding itself in direct competition with the very company that helped fund its rise, since every Microsoft-built AI model that gains traction with customers is effectively an OpenAI API call that Microsoft no longer needs to pay for. Even though OpenAI still represents a substantial portion of Microsoft's overall cloud business backlog, reportedly somewhere around 45%, and Microsoft continues to provide the majority of OpenAI's computing infrastructure, the strategic incentives between the two companies have clearly diverged from where they stood just a couple of years ago. All of this has led to a broader conversation happening among investors and industry analysts about whether Microsoft's massive, sprawling structure, spanning Windows, Office, Azure, Xbox, LinkedIn, and now its AI ambitions, actually makes sense as a single combined company anymore. Some reports from mid-2026 have floated the idea that Microsoft's individual business units could be worth significantly more if valued or potentially separated the way standalone competitors in each space are valued, with some estimates suggesting a combined value as high as $3.8 trillion if broken apart. This kind of sum of the parts conversation tends to emerge specifically when investors start doubting whether a company's combined structure is actually creating more value than its individual pieces would generate on their own, and its appearance in serious financial commentary around Microsoft is itself a meaningful signal about how much uncertainty currently surrounds the company's AI-driven growth story. There's also a deeper, more philosophical challenge sitting underneath all of these individual events, which is the question of whether AI agents themselves might eventually threaten to disconnect users from Microsoft's own applications altogether. If AI assistants become powerful and flexible enough to handle tasks across any software platform, some analysts worry that the specific brand of spreadsheet, word processor, or customer relationship management tool underneath the assistant stops mattering as much to the end user. In that scenario, the company that owns the most helpful AI assistant, regardless of which software it happens to be operating, could end up capturing more of the actual user relationship and value than the company that owns the underlying applications themselves. Microsoft's answer to this risk has been to aggressively embed Copilot everywhere across its own ecosystem, essentially betting that owning both the assistant and the underlying software stack will keep customers locked into the full Microsoft platform rather than switching to a different assistant layered on top of someone else's tools. Whether that bet succeeds is still very much an open question, and it is one of the central uncertainties driving the current skepticism around Microsoft's overall AI strategy. It is worth being fair and balanced here, because there absolutely is a credible counterargument to the idea that Microsoft's AI plan is falling apart in any permanent or catastrophic sense. Several analysts remain genuinely bullish on Microsoft's long-term position, arguing that its massive existing enterprise customer base, its deep integration across nearly every corner of corporate software, and its continued access to OpenAI's technology, even without exclusivity, still give it enormous structural advantages that newer AI-focused companies simply do not have. Some financial forecasts still project meaningful earnings growth for Microsoft over the next several years as its AI investments mature. And enterprise Copilot adoption continues to build, even if that growth arrives more slowly than initial expectations suggested. Microsoft's own leadership has repeatedly pointed to its historical pattern with products like Windows, Office, and Azure, where heavy early investment eventually gave way to durable market dominance once the broader industry caught up to what the company had already built. It is entirely possible that years from now, this current period of stock volatility, underwhelming Copilot numbers, and public admissions of playing catch-up gets remembered as a difficult but ultimately temporary phase in a much longer, more successful AI transformation. But it would also be inaccurate to pretend none of this is happening or to dismiss the significance of what has unfolded over the past several months. A company's own senior AI executive publicly admitting his division is behind competitors is not a small detail. A 36% stock decline from an all-time high is not a minor market fluctuation. The dissolution of exclusive ties with the AI company that Microsoft's entire early AI narrative was built around is not a cosmetic change. And a nearly $100 billion increase in annual capital spending, without matching evidence of proportional revenue growth showing up yet, is exactly the kind of pattern that makes patient long-term investors nervous, even when they still believe in a company's underlying strategy. Put together, these are not isolated, disconnected news stories. They represent a coherent, well-documented shift in how Microsoft's AI ambitions are actually performing compared to how confidently they were originally sold to investors, employees, and the public back when this whole story began. So where does that leave things right now, heading further into 2026? Microsoft remains, by almost any measure, one of the most powerful and well-resourced technology companies on the planet, with enormous cash reserves, an enterprise customer base that most competitors can only dream of matching, and a leadership team that has successfully navigated major platform transitions before. But the aura of inevitability that once surrounded its AI strategy, the sense that Microsoft had somehow already won the AI race the moment it wrote its first check to OpenAI back in 2023, has clearly eroded. Competitors have caught up faster than expected. Copilot adoption has underwhelmed relative to the scale of investment behind it. The exclusive relationship with OpenAI that once looked like a permanent structural advantage has been renegotiated into something far more competitive and uncertain. And the company's own AI leadership has publicly admitted that catching up rather than leading is now the honest description of where things stand. None of this guarantees failure, and none of it should be mistaken for the kind of dramatic, overnight collapse that sensational headlines sometimes imply. But it is a real, substantial, well-documented shift away from the narrative Microsoft spent the last 3 years building, and anyone following the AI industry closely over the coming months should expect this story. The gap between Microsoft's original AI ambitions and its current, messier reality to keep evolving in ways that are genuinely worth watching closely. There is another angle to this story that rarely gets discussed alongside the stock price drama and the executive admissions, which is what is actually happening inside the businesses that are supposed to be adopting all this AI technology. Microsoft publishes its own annual research on workplace trends, and the pattern across recent editions tells an interesting story in itself. A couple of years ago, the conversation centered on what Microsoft described as digital debt, with a majority of knowledge workers reporting they struggled to find enough time and mental energy to actually do their core jobs, let alone learn and adopt new AI tools layered on top of their existing workload. The following year, adoption numbers climbed quickly, with a large majority of knowledge workers reporting they had started using AI tools at work, and a significant share admitting they were bringing outside AI tools into the workplace on their own, often without formal approval from their employer. By 2025, Microsoft had shifted its messaging toward what it called the frontier firm, a vision of organizations restructured around a mix of human employees and AI agents working side by side, with a large share of business leaders expecting agents to become deeply integrated into their company's operations within the following year or so. The most recent edition of this research, published in 2026, arrived at a more sobering conclusion, essentially acknowledging that simply having access to AI tools has not automatically translated into the kind of productivity transformation that had been promised, and that many organizations are still struggling with basic change management problems, meaning employees do not necessarily know how to meaningfully incorporate these tools into their actual daily workflows, even when the technology itself is technically available to them. This matters enormously for Microsoft's broader AI strategy, because Copilot's entire value proposition depends on businesses successfully integrating it into daily operations widely enough to justify its cost. And if large numbers of organizations are still struggling with the basic mechanics of adopting AI tools effectively, that helps explain part of why Copilot's actual paid adoption numbers have landed below where analysts expected them to be by this point. It is also worth placing Microsoft's current situation within the broader context of what is happening across the entire cloud computing and AI infrastructure industry, because Microsoft is not spending this kind of money in isolation. Every major cloud provider, including Amazon, Google, and Microsoft itself, has been engaged in an aggressive industry-wide spending race to build enough data center capacity and computing power to support the current generation of AI models, and increasingly capable future ones. This has created what some analysts describe as a broader industry-wide question about whether the entire sector is overinvesting relative to actual near-term demand, sometimes discussed under the general label of AI bubble concerns. Other major technology companies have made their own enormous financial commitments during this same period, including reports of One Social Media, and technology giant committing tens of billions of dollars to supplement its own computing capacity through partnerships with specialized infrastructure providers. When you place Microsoft's roughly $100 billion increase in projected capital spending within this wider pattern, it becomes clear that Microsoft's challenges are not entirely unique to the company itself, but rather represent one especially visible example of a much larger industry-spanning question about whether the current pace of AI infrastructure investment across the entire technology sector will be matched by proportional revenue growth over the coming years, or whether a painful correction is waiting somewhere down the road for companies that have overextended themselves. Competition is another piece of this puzzle worth examining more closely, because Microsoft's AI challenges are not happening in a vacuum where it simply needs to execute better on its own plan. The competitive landscape around it has genuinely intensified. Anthropic's Claude models have built a strong reputation, particularly among software developers and enterprise coding teams, which helps explain why Microsoft reportedly felt the need to restrict its own employees from using Anthropic's coding assistant internally. Google has continued pushing its own Gemini models deeper into its search, workplace, and cloud products, leveraging its existing massive consumer and enterprise reach in ways that directly compete with Microsoft's own AI ambitions across similar product categories. Coding-focused startups like Cursor have captured significant mindshare among software developers specifically, a group that Microsoft has traditionally considered one of its core strongholds through products like GitHub and Visual Studio. And OpenAI itself, now free from its exclusive obligations to Microsoft, has been aggressively pursuing new partnerships and distribution channels across competing cloud providers, essentially transforming from a company that once needed Microsoft's infrastructure and money to survive into an increasingly independent competitor with its own growing leverage in the industry. When Microsoft's own AI chief openly describes his division as playing catch-up. This is the specific competitive landscape he is referring to, a group of rivals that have each carved out genuine strength in specific areas that used to look like natural Microsoft advantages. Adding yet another layer of complexity to this picture is an ongoing legal dispute that has kept Microsoft's name tied to OpenAI's internal controversies, even as the two companies work to separate their business arrangements. A lawsuit involving one of OpenAI's original co-founders has named Microsoft as a co-defendant centered on allegations related to how OpenAI's nonprofit origins were handled as the company transitioned toward a more traditional for-profit corporate structure. The case reportedly involves claims seeking damages in the range of $150 billion, with a trial expected to run for several weeks. And testimony expected from some of the most recognizable names in the AI industry, including OpenAI's own leadership and Microsoft's chief executive. Regardless of how that legal proceeding ultimately resolves, its mere existence adds another layer of uncertainty and public scrutiny to a Microsoft AI narrative that was already dealing with plenty of other challenges, and it is a reminder that Microsoft's AI fortunes remain tied to OpenAI's own legal and organizational stability in ways that extend well beyond simple cloud computing contracts. None of this means Microsoft lacks a path forward, and it is worth spending a moment on what that path actually looks like, according to the company's own public statements. Microsoft's leadership has pointed to several specific pillars of its comeback strategy going forward. Custom-designed AI chips are meant to reduce the company's dependency on external chip suppliers while potentially lowering its own long-term computing costs. Deeper integration between its AI models and the actual software tools people use every day, rather than treating AI as a separate bolt-on feature, is meant to make Copilot and related products feel more genuinely useful rather than gimmicky. And heavier investment in reinforcement learning techniques, the same category of machine learning approach that helped produce breakthrough results in specialized domains like game-playing systems, is meant to help Microsoft's own models improve their reasoning and problem-solving capabilities over time, rather than simply relying on scaling up model size alone. Whether these specific bets pay off remains to be seen, and skeptical analysts have pointed out that competitors are pursuing very similar strategies simultaneously, meaning none of these approaches guarantees Microsoft a durable advantage just because it is pursuing them. If you found this breakdown useful, the broader story of how the AI industry's biggest early leaders are now scrambling to keep up with faster-moving rivals is one of the most important business stories unfolding in technology right now, and it is far from finished. Keep watching how Microsoft's relationship with OpenAI continues to evolve. Keep an eye on whether Copilot adoption numbers improve as the product matures, and pay attention to whether that enormous capital spending eventually translates into the kind of revenue growth that would justify it, because the answers to those questions over the next year or two will determine whether this current rough patch turns out to be a temporary stumble or the beginning of something much more serious for one of the most dominant companies in the history of the technology industry. It is also worth remembering just how quickly narratives in the technology industry can flip in either direction. 3 years ago, almost nobody would have predicted that Microsoft's early OpenAI investment would eventually be described in some corners of the financial press as a company scrambling to defend itself against the very ecosystem it helped create. Equally, it is entirely plausible that 3 years from now, today's headlines about stock declines, underwhelming Copilot numbers, and public admissions of playing catch-up will look like a temporary rough patch inside a much longer, ultimately successful transformation. The same way earlier rough patches during Microsoft's shift toward cloud computing under Azure eventually gave way to one of the most successful corporate turnarounds in recent technology history. The difference this time is the sheer scale of money involved, the speed at which competitors are moving, and the fact that Microsoft is no longer the only company with deep pockets and serious ambitions in this space. That combination is exactly why so many analysts, employees, and outside observers are watching Microsoft's next few quarters so closely, because whichever direction this story ultimately breaks will likely shape how the entire technology industry thinks about the return on massive AI infrastructure investment for years to come. For now, the honest, well-documented answer is that Microsoft's AI plan has run into real, substantial turbulence, even if it is far too early to say with certainty how the rest of this story will eventually play out.